Welcome to my talk, which is called Identifying Pottery. And this is the same talk which I gave at the Guildhall in London for the Thames Festival. And I wanted to put it on YouTube so that people who couldn't make the talk could have a listen in and listen again and again if you want to. So it was a great privilege giving a talk at a historic venue like the Guildhall. I don't know if you know, but the Guildhall is a medieval hall in the City of London, and when some excavations were carried on there, they discovered that it's actually on part of the site of the Roman amphitheatre, and actually the foundations of the Roman amphitheatre can be viewed on a subterranean level in the Guildhall. So it's a very exciting venue, a great place to show mudlarking finds. And I really want to thank the Guildhall for giving me the opportunity to talk about pottery there, and also to thank Jason and Marie Louise and Monica, who arranged everything behind the scenes and have been instrumental in having a great September full of mudlarking exhibitions. I've been a mudlarker now for over 20 years. And it's true that once you start mudlarking, sometimes there are certain sorts of artefact or certain types of find that just catch your imagination, that you end up gravitating to. Some people it's beads, some people pipes, clay pipes, other people it's cufflinks, and you know who you are. But for me, it's always been pottery. So the first time I wandered onto the foreshore, I was starting to pick up pot. Well, that's another story. I started to pick up pottery and was fascinated by it, even though they were just broken fragments. And as a great encouragement for those who are just starting out on your mudlarking journey or trying to get some of your pottery identified, when I started mudlarking, I actually had no idea what the pottery was that I was finding. No idea of age, looked old, but really had no idea what vessels it came from, who had made it, what it was made for, how it was made. So I really knew nothing, and this was despite having an archaeology degree. To be fair to the University of Liverpool, it wasn't a very practical archaeology degree, more sort of cultural history really. But from that point on, I began my journey of identifying the pottery that I'd found on the Thames foreshore and trying to get some handle, as it were, on how old it was and who made it. So I started looking into books and museum displays, but I quickly found that, great resources though they are, a lot of the items on display to the public in museums and a lot of items in books are complete, unusual, high status and highly decorated. Not really like the average pottery that everyday folk would have been using throughout history, especially more middle class or working class people, you might call it. And certainly the objects pictured in the books were not like the pieces of pottery that I was finding. So not like the average finds when you go mudlarking, beachcombing, field walking, that type of thing. So for example, there are hundreds of books and articles written about 18th century British porcelain, even though it's very rarely found in excavations and rarely found outside the sale room or museum displays, and is often very expensive. But there are just a couple of books and a couple of articles dedicated to post-medieval redware, which every household had tons of and everybody used, and is found everywhere. Wherever you walk, wherever you put your spade into the soil, you find post-medieval redware everywhere. So a bit of a mismatch. When I went and actually started researching, and museum curators and pottery specialists were helping me, I found that more helpful, because they would often very helpfully get boxes of finds from excavations, and that was great to look through those typical finds from typical excavations in London. And I think there's no substitute when it comes to learning about pottery in actually handling pottery, handling Roman pottery, handling medieval pottery, especially broken shards from excavations. And I think that's a great way of getting your eye in and getting a feel for the period. And when you go down to the foreshore or field walking, then it's much easier to identify stuff. And also online forums. People are very, very generous with their time and knowledge. And on Facebook and Instagram, there are plenty of forums for ancient pottery and pottery finds generally. And people will weigh in with their opinions quite happily. So that was really one of the reasons why I decided to write my book. Shard, let's get this straight from the start. Shard, S-H-E-R-D, bit of broken pottery. Shard, S-H-A-R-D, a piece of broken glass, in my opinion. But I wanted to write a book where, not ignoring the high status stuff completely, but generally charting the whole history of everyday and useful pottery, the sort of things that the average person would use, break, throw away, and the average person would come afterwards and find field walking or mudlarking. Pottery has been used in this country for 6,000 years now, so it's a huge subject, and I'm not going to be able to cover every aspect of that in the next 45 minutes. If I did, I'd have to take 3/4 of a second per year, and I don't think, since I've already wasted about 10 minutes introducing the subject, we're not going to get that far. So I can't cover everything, but I'm hoping to cover the basics and tending towards the London and South East area, just because that was my audience at the Guildhall, people who are mainly interested in mudlarking on the Thames. I make no apology that I'm going to get quite technical sometimes with the clay fabrics and the firing techniques and decorative techniques, because it's that sort of detail which will help you to identify the age of the pottery that you find. So let's have a look at the three main types of pottery that you will encounter. That is earthenware, stoneware, porcelain, and porcelain's close cousin, bone china. And we'll look at the characteristics of these. So starting with earthenware. Earthenware is your entry-level pottery. So dig up some clay, expose it to heat, there you go, pottery. So right from Neolithic bowls, right to your garden centre flower pot, the whole history of earthenware. It's all earthenware. Earthenware is fired at a low temperature. It's porous, that means without any special treatment it will absorb liquids. It's rough, sandy, dusty feeling, it's soft, and any inclusions or temper which are added to the clay or naturally occurring in the clay are generally visible to the naked eye. By temper, I mean temper is something that a potter will add to the clay to help with the firing process, or as decoration, or even as a symbolic act, sometimes with prehistoric pottery. If earthenware breaks, then it will stain and it will absorb liquids from the soil or mud in which it is placed. So all prehistoric pottery, all Roman pottery, and all early medieval pottery, up to the point in the 14th century when the Germans started importing stoneware, these are all earthenware vessels. And obviously in the post-medieval period, huge quantities of earthenware were made, and in different types and decorative effects. So it's a big thing. So I mentioned stoneware just now. Stoneware was first made in Europe in the late 13th century by the Germans. And stoneware is fired to a much higher temperature than earthenware, so high that the clay actually fuses, making it impervious to liquids, which is a great advantage. It doesn't need to be glazed, but sometimes it is for decorative reasons. Stoneware, as the name implies, is hard. It rings when you strike it, unlike earthenware, which has a dull sound. and also when it's broken it doesn't absorb water, so it's not stained in the soil like earthenware. And also because the clay is fused in the firing, visible inclusions are very few, maybe just confined to some dots which appear in the clay. So the other type of clay which we might encounter is porcelain. This began to be made commercially in this country in the 1740s, although it was imported long before this date. Porcelain is a mix of materials fired to an even higher temperature than stoneware. The fabric is actually glassy and it has a conchoidal fracture. That is, the break looks like glass. Where the clay is broken, it looks like glass. Importantly, the main characteristic of porcelain and bone china is that it's translucent, that is, light shines through it. There are many different porcelain recipes. Most Chinese and European porcelain is hard paste porcelain, and British 18th century porcelain is mostly soft paste porcelain. Soon after 1800, the Staffordshire potters discovered that if you add burnt bone to the mix, it makes the fabric a lot stronger and more hard wearing. And this is bone china, which is the standard British porcelain. So yes, bone china is actually made of bones. I imagine mainly animal bones rather than human bones. It would be rather disturbing if your granny's favourite china was made out of other people's grannies, but I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's just animal bone. Anyway, let's have a look at the development of earthenware. This talk is billed as identifying Roman pottery onwards, but why don't we sneak in a bit of prehistoric pottery while we're at it? Promise you won't tell anybody, will you? Prehistoric pottery is very rarely found. It does appear on the Thames in different places. It's very low-fired pottery. There was no proper kiln technology. It's just fired in a glorified bonfire known as a clamp kiln. And for this reason, it's very fragile. There was no glaze available, although there was burnishing techniques that could be used. It's coil or slab built. There were no potter's wheels in the prehistoric period. And as I said, it's very low fired, so it's actually very fragile pottery, so it doesn't survive well in many environments. Sometimes in excavations, pottery is found which is hard on the surfaces, but the actual middle of the pot is still plastic, still raw clay. Clamp firing, because of the exposure to flame, often gives a very multicoloured surface with different colours like black, grey and red appearing on the same pot in different patches, and the core is often very underfired black or grey. Any inclusions that have been left in the fabric or added are often large and very visible. Decoration is varied over the period of prehistoric pottery. Impressed decoration, finger marks, sometimes cords were whipped onto the surface of the pots, making like a maggot effect on it. And it's also very difficult to date precisely. For a lot of the prehistoric period, there are no coins, obviously, to help with dating sites or metal artefacts appearing, or they're very rare. So often there's a very, very wide age range given for prehistoric pottery when it is found in excavations. Turning now to the Roman period. Roman pottery can be divided generally into two sorts. Fine wares, that is pottery that was used at the table or for drinking, and coarse wares, pottery relegated to the kitchen for cooking, storage or industrial purposes. There is quite a bit of overlap between the two, but it's good to deal with them separately. The Romans were master potters, and even their coursewares are sometimes amazingly thin and well potted, an economy of clay and a beauty in simple decoration, which I don't think was excelled until the 18th century, probably in this country. Anyway, the Romans brought in a lot of new technology to this country, the wheel, the potter's wheel, and the kiln, proper kilns, and even lead glaze, although the objects that they used lead glaze on are pretty rare, high status, often highly decorated. So it's general to say the average Roman site, and certainly all Roman coursewares, are never glazed, and that's a good thing to differentiate them from later pottery. So rather than glaze, the Romans employed two different methods to make their pottery more water able to contain liquids. That is burnishing and the use of slip. So burnishing is just rubbing the surface of a pot with a stone or a tool, which just compacts the surface, makes it shiny, and makes it more able to contain liquids. Burnishing can be all over, in decorative bands, or in distinctive lattices, but never lettuces. Lattices, not lettuces, please. So these lattices, they are burnished or sometimes incised as well, and they're a very, very common decorative feature on Roman pottery. Now you get an obtuse lattice before 200 AD and acute lattices after 200 AD. And I often find myself thinking of Madonna's video for Vogue when I do that. Obtuse lattice, acute lattice. So obtuse lattice, acute lattice. Do you know why? It makes me think of Vogue. But there we go. That's just me. Slip is a liquid clay, and pots can be dipped into it, or it can be applied to the surface in different patterns, dots, words can be written with it, or it can be applied and built up very thickly to produce an almost three-dimensional figure like an animal. Hunt cups are a good example of this method. So slip and burnishing are glossy, like a glaze, look superficially like a glaze, but they quickly wear off the high points in a very distinctive way. Samian, properly named sigillata, and colour-coated pottery, which are two very common sort of fine wares, are both slip-coated. The Romans introduced the widespread use of kilns and understood how to control firings to produce the clay colour they desired. So if they wanted a red-bodied clay, then they would allow oxygen to circulate freely in the kiln, and this is known as an oxidised firing. If they wanted a grey colour fabric from the same clay, then they starved the kiln of oxygen at the right moments, and this produces a reduced firing, which results in a grey clay body. So a lot of Roman coursewares are grey-bodied, and they're known as greywares, obviously. There are also a lot of greywares made in the medieval period, from 1150 to 1350. So sometimes it's easy to confuse the two, unless you've got a diagnostic feature. For example, decoration, like the lattices I spoke about, or a rim form, or the form of the vessel itself. So Roman greyware beakers, but not medieval beakers, doesn't happen. Roman rims are often very rounded and sinuous, and medieval rims are often very squared off and straight edged in the profile. Let's look at some Roman coursewares. There are several distinctive types with different characteristics. Mortaria, amphorae and flagons. So mortaria are bowls for grinding sauces or mixing, and are very distinctive because grits were added to the interior surface but not to the exterior. and they often have very easily grippable rims, curved or hooked, because they had to be held quite firmly. There is an overlap here between coarsewares and finewares because you do get Samian mortaria as well. Amphorae, amphora in the singular, people are very familiar with these vessels. Very large vessels used for long-term transportation, long-distance transportation in the empire, for importing items, olive oil, wine, preserved fruit, sauces, and they were shipped across the whole empire by sea and by cart and by barge, presumably. They're very large, thick vessels, some weighed up to 25 kilograms empty. They have very large, thick handles, so they're quite distinctive when found. The only things they might be confused with are post-medieval Spanish oil jars, which performed a similar function and were made in the same areas in some cases. Although the post-medieval Spanish oil jars often have a distinctive white slip on the outside, so you can distinguish them from amphorae fragments. Flagons were used for serving liquid, mostly wine, I guess, and the most distinctive part of these vessels is the rim and the handle shape, and so that's a good way of distinguishing them. Let's look now at the medieval period, and the most distinctive feature of medieval pottery is organic or mineral tempers and inclusions which are visible in the clay, often to the naked eye, and recognising these and what type they are can help to date a piece of pottery. So the following guidelines, with some caveats, is reliable dating for medieval pottery in the southeast area anyway. Organic tempers, so this is talking about straw or grass, or very commonly shell, which is visible as white flakes or plates in pottery fabrics, were added to the clay in the medieval period and were not filtered out, and these often helped with the firing process. Sometimes organic temper can leach or burn out of the surfaces of vessels, leaving distinctive voids. Organic temper was not used in this area of the country after the 13th century, and the mineral inclusions, which is often black and white dots, fragments of quartz and flint, are not seen after 1500, so it's a very medieval characteristic. The exceptions that you might find in the southwest, sorry guys from the southwest, there are gravel tempered industries that continue until the early 19th century. Also, across the country, some post-medieval industrial processes used heavily tempered fabrics. For example, bronze vessel casting and bell casting. But often these fragments will not be confused with pottery shards very easily. Something that might and does happen is broken and weathered drain pipes and some coarse brick fabrics. These can deceive and look like older pottery, especially on beaches where the rough environment makes pottery look older much quicker. And I think it's a pottery hunter's rite of passage to post an ancient looking piece of pottery and to be told by someone that it's a drain pipe. It's not a problem, not a big deal, and hey, a drain pipe can be up to 200 years old. So what other characteristics can we observe in medieval pottery? Well, there's a very limited range of forms. Most medieval pottery is either jar for cooking, a cooking pot, or a jug for serving liquids, wine and beer, etc. And other forms are known, but they're pretty unusual, and most of the pottery encountered will be either pots, jars, or jugs. Both types often have thumbed bases, which help with stability. And if there are handles, obviously with the jugs there are, these are usually stabbed and slashed. This was partly decorative and partly to help release water vapour during firing. How about glaze? Well, glaze begins to appear again after the Roman period in the 10th century, but doesn't really become common until the 13th century. Medieval glaze tends to be patchy, not an all-over, unless it's a very highly decorative jug. So often with a jug they just put a little bib of glaze on the front near the spout. Medieval potters could produce several different colours of glaze, although green is probably the most common, with copper metal added as a colouring agent. Many vessels in the medieval period were unglazed completely anyway. Sometimes in medieval periods the glaze was applied as a powder to the surface of the vessel, and this results in distinctive pitting surrounded by spots of glaze, and that's quite a distinctive medieval feature. So that's quite a good range of details that can assign a medieval date to a shard. At this point it might be helpful just to compare late medieval pottery with early post-medieval pottery, and just to analyse the differences, as there is possibly some confusion between the two. Of course there is an overlap, because people didn't wake up on the 1st of January 1500 and suddenly say, right, we're post-medieval people now, we're not going to have any of this gritty pottery, we're going to throw it all away. So obviously it took a little while for the whole overlap to take place across every strata of society. But it's fair to say that there was a ceramic revolution at the end of the medieval period which changed pottery forever, mainly fueled by the consumer, who wanted more forms of pottery, they wanted better quality pottery, eating and drinking habits changed, and whole new industries developed to meet the need for this new style of pottery, which was also imitating what was coming in from the continent as well. We were following continental trends in this. So let's compare two fabrics, and I've got a photograph as well. One is medieval, one is post-medieval. They're made of the same clay, the same basic clay, and they're made in the same area of Surrey and Hampshire borders. But you can see from the photo that the latter potter has removed most of the grits from his clay to produce a finer product. There's still a few grits, but compared with the medieval pottery, which is on the left of the photo, you can see that the medieval one is much coarser, much grittier. The post-medieval product would be better glazed, probably a whole interior or exterior surface would be fully glazed, and there was a much wider range of forms supplied for different cooking processes, serving, and especially for drinking as well. Well, much as I love picking up Roman and medieval shards and get a kick out of thinking who was the last person who used this and what sort of time of history it's lived through, but I find the post-medieval period, in terms of pottery technology, the most interesting, because there's so much going on. There's a lot to cover, so we'll see how we get on with that. Looking first at post-medieval pottery on buff-coloured clay, that's an off-white clay, certainly not pure white clay. A quick word about Tudor Green. Strictly speaking, this is a type of pottery rather than pottery from a specific location. It refers to thin-walled vessels and very thin-walled vessels which are used for serving drink or drinking from. Thicker green glazed shards are often called Tudor Green, but they're not. They're actually a bit later. They're borderware, which was used in huge quantities in London in a wide variety of forms up to about 1700. including my very favourite piece of pottery, not because of what it is or what date it is, just because of the name. It's called a pipkin, and here is one. So let's have a look at redwares, which are, in terms of post-medieval pottery, the most common foreshore find. For most post-medieval pottery, redwares are relegated to purely functional purposes, cooking and industrial uses, with forms that, because they were functional, changed very little over the centuries. So consequently, if you have a non-diagnostic shard, they're very difficult to date, and often you can just say, well, it dates from the 16th to the 19th century, and some redwares were even made in the 20th century, so quite a broad range of dates. Although some earlier redwares can be assigned to a more closer date, especially decorated redwares or with slip coating under the glaze, which is visible as a white line. They slip coated the vessels to try and make it look like a posher, whiter clay vessel. These date from 1480 to 1650. Also redwares with grey cores, caused by firings where the temperature wasn't hot enough to oxidise the clay all the way through the body. These are likely to be 16th century or early 17th century. Some of the nicest redwares which you can find are those which are decorated with slip. So liquid clay trailed onto the surface of the vessels, covered with a clear glaze, which makes the slip look yellow after firing. So there's a number of very recognisable industries. The first being metropolitan slipware. This dates from 1630 to 1720. There is obviously the well-known Staffordshire type slipware. I say type as it was made in other places as well as Staffordshire. A lot was made in London right through to the 19th century. And this is well known as well as for trailed slipware, for the feathered slipware, the Bakewell tart effect, if you will. This can also appear on buff coloured clay as well as redwares, and it dates from the late 17th century right through to the mid 19th century. A later form of slipware is the Sunderland type slipware, again made in other places other than the northeast, and this dates from about 1790 to around 1900. Turning now, looking at stonewares, as I mentioned, huge quantities of stoneware were imported from Germany for 300 years before we started making it ourselves, and then after that time huge quantities of stoneware were made around Britain. So the Germans made mostly drinking cups and jugs, and these arrived from the middle of the 14th century onwards. The first ones to arrive were made in Siegburg, and they run through to about 1500. Then vessels were made in Cologne and Frechen. The famous Bartman were first made in Cologne with the bearded face on the neck of the jug, very globular bodies and often with a crest or decoration on the belly or a coat of arms. The Cologne and Frechen ones, Cologne the 16th century, and then production moved to Frechen for the 16th century through to the early 18th century. They were still being imported. From the late 17th century into the 18th century, most production was made in the Westerwald, using blue and purple glazes and profusion of decoration. They're making drinking jugs and tankards, and also a lot of chamber pots. So we started making our own stonewares from the late 17th century, at first imitating the German vessels and producing our own version of the Bartman. But from the 18th century, large quantities of drinking, vessels, serving liquids, vessels for serving liquids and storage, and forms which basically changed very little over time, very utilitarian, especially into the 19th century, throughout the 19th century. Ink pots, penny inks, master inks, blacking pots, ginger beer bottles and flagons. These were normally salt glazed. The earlier vessels with a very distinctive mottled glaze, the tiger glaze, although it looks more like a leopard to me, but there we go. And over time this became more uniformly brown rather than mottled, certainly into the 19th century. And from 1835 a new method of glazing called the Bristol glaze appears, and this becomes more prominent and right into the 20th century with a very white bottom and a mustard coloured dipped top for the vessels. Turning now to fine wares, we looked at the earlier buff wares, now look at the later development. Let's look at the later development. So through the 18th century, the way that we cooked and the way people ate and drank radically changed. The open fire gave way to the range, so no more pipkins, sad emoji, sadly no more pipkins. But hello to baking dishes, which is great news. Communal chargers, which were placed in the middle of the table and where people helped themselves, gave way to individual plates for each person by about 1720. And new forms of recipes and roasting and lots of sauces with meals demanded platters, tureens and stands of different types. People started drinking huge quantities of tea, coffee and also hot chocolate, and these needed china vessels, tea bowls and tea saucers and teapots to serve and to make. And in terms of how people wanted their china to look, the bar was set by bar was raised by Chinese export porcelain with its blue and white decoration and pure white fabric. So that's what the British potters were imitating when they were making china for sale. And the first industry to imitate Chinese porcelain, and really the first factory-based industry with a huge output, was tin glazed earthenware. This was made on a buff or reddish fabric with a tin glaze, a white tin glaze with hand painted decoration. The glaze is very fragile, so it's very easily chipped at the edges, very easily pitted. Sometimes disappears completely from a vessel if it's in a harsh environment. And this dates from the 17th and 18th centuries. White salt glazed stoneware was much stronger than tin glaze and actually able to take hot liquids, unlike tin glaze. It has a very characteristic orange peel surface, which is rough and not really perfect for decoration, and this dates from the 1720s to the 1780s. Large quantities of teawares and plates and chargers were made in this material. Then we get the succession of refined earthenwares, with the potters trying to produce whiter and whiter fabric to imitate Chinese porcelain. Firstly hand decorated, and then transfer printed, which allowed mass production. So refined earthenwares with transfer printing was a marriage made in heaven for the consumer who wanted dinner and tea services with all their pieces matching. So it allowed affordable china to be made in great designs. allowed transfer printed British earthenware to basically conquer a world market, exported in huge quantities to every quarter of the globe. And it's very easy, anywhere you walk, any field, any foreshore, that you can see blue and white fragments of pottery everywhere. These date from the late 18th century right through to the 20th century. Well, I think that probably wraps up our very quick journey through the history of pottery. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to go into more detail, then you could have a look at my book, which is called Shard, and this has 598 pages of information of pottery covering the whole history in this country, 6,000 years from the Neolithic period to the 20th century. And that is available on eBay and Etsy. If you search Richard Henry Shard, you will find it. Well, thank you for watching, and please do get in touch if you have any questions about pottery. Thank you, bye.